philosophy that you teach in terms of diet is diametrically opposed to what I teach.
Yeah, I know that.
Oh, you know that. You're familiar with my work.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't want to get into arguments today because I know you believe as strongly as I do in our particular approaches. What I want to know, what I'd like to try and find out during this particular hour is why the differences. Could you start out by telling people basically what you believe?
Yeah, sure. I believe that as a physician, I've been called upon to treat an awful lot of people with a lot of medical conditions, which have arisen because, in large part, the diet of the 20th century just doesn't work and is causing certain medical problems. And I also believe that it's important for the physician to find out just what the specific problems are that a person has, and then to come up with a diet which is corrective of that disturbance. And I think starting from scratch, perhaps the theories that you're espousing might work very well, but unfortunately we're not starting from scratch. We now have a population which is victimized by an epidemic of an insulin disorder that's based on the fact that we've been fed too much refined carbohydrates, too much sugar, and we just simply haven't been able to keep that mechanism under control. So we have about 50 million or more Americans with documented or documentable insulin resistance and hyperinsulinism, which leads them to, number one, obesity, which is the number one consequence, but there are consequences even more serious than that, namely high blood pressure and all the blood sugar disturbances, including diabetes, and its number one sequel, which is coronary heart disease. So you see heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and a variety of other conditions caused perhaps in greatest part by a disturbance in insulin metabolism.
Okay, let me just bring it to the point here because I've got to take a break. Basically, you think it's the carbohydrates, and the way we ought to approach the problem is to eat a high-protein diet consisting of poultry, various kinds of meats, and to avoid starches and simple sugars. Is that right?
Well, not quite.
Well, we'll get to it in detail in just a moment. Unfortunately, we have to take a commercial break. This is Dr. John Mcdougall on the Northern California Radio Network, and my guest is Dr. Robert Atkins. He wrote The Diet Revolution, and now Dr. Atkins' new Diet Revolution, which is, I'm sure, a bestseller in the various bookstores. If I could just try and summarize, and I don't do this to take away from your message, I just want to make sure that I bring the understanding to my listeners and also to me and make sure I have it correct. Essentially, what we've talked about so far is that elevated insulin levels, which you believe are caused by high carbohydrates, particularly the refined carbohydrates in our diet, result in various diseases like high blood pressure, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and so on. And the solution to the problem is to get away from the carbohydrates and hit the high-protein foods hard, such as beef, poultry, fish products, eggs, cheese, and so on. Is that correct?
Well, the solution is to bypass the problem. If you have a carbohydrate disorder and then you don't eat carbohydrates, then you become a normal person with regard to your entire metabolic profile, because you've bypassed the only problem that you have.
And the problem in your mind is carbohydrates. Well, the
problem in our experience, and remember my experience involves 40,000 patients that we've treated at the Atkins Center since the 60s.
Yes.
And my experience has been, and I work with a lot of different diets, but the one that has consistently worked the best for this group of people, and I certainly am not into a one-diet-fits-all philosophy at all. I think you have to match the diet to the clinical problem. But the clinical problem of overweight people is, and that's documented over and over again, certainly our lab work clearly shows it, the problem is hyperinsulinism. This is what you find. You don't find slight elevations of the insulin level. You find 5, 10, 20 times the normal amount of insulin response in overweight people as you do in normal people. And we simply bypass their problem by taking away their carbohydrates. Yes, that leaves them free to eat the meat, the fish, the fowl, the eggs, and the cheese, the foods which don't have carbohydrates.
All right, and part of the key, as I understand from following your philosophy over years, is that what you end up doing is putting them into ketosis, and as a consequence, they lose weight. And is it the weight loss that corrects that hyperinsulinism?
The word consequence is a little inappropriate. Ketosis is simply a measure of the burning of your stored fat. When you burn your stored fat, it breaks down into free fatty acids and ketone bodies. That's the way it breaks down. That's the way it serves as fuel. So when we put people into ketosis, we're simply saying, okay, now you're going to use your stored fat as the fuel. You've been storing it all these years. Finally, you get a chance to burn it up, use it for fuel, which is the only way you can burn it up, and become slim. And the consequence is that the weight loss, the project of losing weight is extremely easy when a person can eat all the fish and chicken and steak that he wants 3, 4, 5 times a day if necessary without worrying about quantity, and still undergo a weight loss of about a pound a day and consistently and lose weight as long as he stays on such a diet. And for the person who likes to eat animal food, it's an absolute breeze. For the person that is a vegetarian and doesn't like it, it's not a very pleasant diet.
Well, Dr. Atkins, tell me, is it the weight loss then that corrects the hyperinsulinism?
No, I would say not. The hyperinsulinism is corrected by not stimulating insulin release by giving carbohydrates. So we'll take a person who has one of these problems, let's say hypertension. 60% of hypertension has now been adjudged, certainly by Gerald Reaven at Stanford and that group, to be due to hyperinsulinism. So as soon as we take the carbohydrates away, 3 days later, we've got a blood pressure drop of 15, 20 points. And certainly they haven't lost a lot of weight in 3 days.
So you think that the carbohydrates themselves stimulate elevated blood pressure?
Well, I mean, everybody's eating carbohydrates. I'm saying the absence of carbohydrates corrects the insulin disorder and allows the blood pressure to become normal.
Is it possible that the ketoacidosis dilates the blood vessels and causes the drop in blood pressure?
Well, I haven't considered that possibility, and I don't think that that's what happens.
Okay. There are a couple of things, from my background, from my education, that I have to introduce here.
Okay.
One is that work by Bierman and Brunzell, University of Washington.
Ed Bierman, we were classmates.
Oh, good. Well, he did work on adult type diabetics, and what he did is he replaced, he increased the white sugar content of the diet. Are you familiar with the study published in the New England Journal in 1978? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And when they doubled the white sugar content of the diet, every aspect of diabetes became better, including 24-hour sugars. You
know what the problem is? You're not atypical of a lot of physicians who look at that work and come to that conclusion, but we're talking about a J-shaped or a U-shaped curve. And what he's working with is just one limb of that curve, which is on a group of diets, all of which are high in carbohydrate, none of which are low in carbohydrate. And yeah, along that limb of the curve, you get that relationship. But you get into the ultra-low carbohydrate intake, you find exactly the opposite relationship.
Okay, but his conclusion in the article was that even pure white sugar, the most disgusting carbohydrate, stimulates insulin sensitivity, makes insulin work better. Was that not correct?
Well, if that was his conclusion under those circumstances, okay, that's true. But that is not the same as talking about what happens when you restrict carbohydrates.
All right, then
we're talking about a completely different.
Okay, I'm not trying to say you don't get results, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to see why other people get completely different results than you do, and how maybe we can see some common truth in this whole thing.
All right, they get different results from me because they don't do the same thing.
All right, well, let me ask you about some other work that you're familiar with, and that's Dr. James Anderson at the University of Kentucky in Lexington at his medical school. What he does is he increases the carbohydrate in the form of complex carbohydrates and even fruits to around 65-75% of the intake, and drastically reduces the protein intake, and he gets somewhere between half and 2/3 of adult diabetics off all insulin, and he gets essentially all diabetics off of all of their diabetic pills. Now, that's completely opposite.
We accomplish exactly that.
Why?
Probably quicker. And, I just had a patient just this morning in my office who'd been on 40 units of insulin and for about 4 years.
But how can two separate diets, how can two diametrically opposed approaches get the same results is what I want to know. Now, you're a man of great experience.
All right, you want to go to Southeast Asia? Do you want to go by way of, you want to fly west or you want to fly east? You'll get there either way.
Okay, well, that doesn't explain it to me, but
yes, it does. I mean, because why couldn't two diametrically opposed systems work?
Well, obviously they do. I'm taking from granted, I'm starting the show with the idea that what you do does work, and you do get these results. I don't doubt that at all.
Oh, you can't. You better
What I'm trying to understand is why two completely separate approaches can get similar results, and I'm sure a lot of my listeners want to know the same thing.
Well,
so,
I think we have to start off with the weakness of the balance.
Let's do that in just a moment, because I'm going to have to take another commercial break. This is Dr. John Mcdougall with Dr. Robert Atkins, and I'll be back with you in just a couple of moments. The guest is Dr. Robert Atkins. Dr. Atkins, before we try and sort this thing out a little better as to why two diametrically opposed approaches can get the same results, I want to ask you about some other research that both of us are familiar with, and that's research that was started in the 1920s by Dr. Hinsworth and carried on by Dr. Shirley Sweeney.
That one I don't know.
Oh, you're not familiar with Hinsworth is the father of this whole thing. He's the father of the insulin response and diabetes and the effect of foods. And
Hinsworth.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And Dr. Shirley Sweeney. And remember Dr. Shirley Sweeney took his medical students, his 20-year-old medical students, and he fed them 3 different kinds of diets, one high in carbohydrate, in fact, half was sugar, half was starch, and one high in fat and one high in protein. And the one high in protein, he took all those healthy 20-year-old medical students, the one high in fat, those healthy 20-year-old medical students, he fed them a very high-fat diet. It was very greasy. And he created a diabetes according to the glucose tolerance test in every one of his medical students. Then he turned around and the next week fed them a diet for 2 days.
Well, now, wait, this wasn't this really short-term thing where he took advantage of the, did a glucose tolerance test immediately after being on that diet.
Well, of course.
Because that's considered to be a fallacious science now, because you have to at least give the body a chance to equilibrate before you do a glucose tolerance.
Well, the way I look at it, the reason I was taught that you had to put somebody on carbohydrates for 2 days before you do the glucose tolerance test is because you'd end up with almost all Americans showing some element of glucose intolerance because they eat such a greasy diet.
Yeah, but it would be an artifact, yeah.
Well, so the point is that what Shirley Sweeney found in the 1920s is that fat paralyzes insulin and carbohydrate actually makes insulin work better. And people over and over and over again, Dr. Sine in 1955 in his Lancet article showed the same thing. Over and over again, they show carbohydrates make insulin work better, and yet what you find is just the opposite. You find carbohydrates make insulin work worse. No,
I'm not saying that. I'm talking about, number one, we're talking about hyperinsulinism.
Yes, well,
we're talking about not making the insulin work better, but bypassing an abnormality.
But if it doesn't work well, then the body produces more, and you get hyperinsulinism. And Farquhar and many other people have shown that when you feed high-fat diets, you get elevated insulin levels.
Yeah, but you're still looking at, you continue to look at what happens if you add fat to a diet with carbohydrates. Okay. You keep making that same misplaced conclusion.
All right.
You have to look at 0 carbohydrate as or 20 grams or some very low carbohydrate to ask what happens when we have changed the primary fuel of the body from carbohydrate and glycogen to stored fat. Okay. What happens when a person is burning stored fat? Actually, it's much more similar to the condition of fasting, but in a sense it's a modified fast. But the similarity between carbohydrate restriction and fasting is what has been noticed throughout the literature. Now, you're talking about studies which are really not basically dealing with what we're observing or what we're creating. We're creating a situation where the person burns his fat because it is the next fuel in the pecking order of fuels to be burned after the carbohydrates have been very systematically slashed.
Would you say that the mechanism involved in your approach is similar to people who use little cans of protein powder, like the Cambridge diet, like the OptiFast program? Are we talking about a similar mechanism?
It started off that way, but it isn't.
Why?
Because what they're doing is they're just taking a fast and modifying it by some protein, but now they've made now they're modifying it by about 30 grams of carbohydrate as well.
So they're making a mistake by adding the carbohydrate.
Well, they're taking away the number one advantage of a low-carbohydrate diet, which is you can eat as much as you want. I mean, if you're going to be on a diet, you might as well eat, because eating is the one thing that people really miss if they're on the other kind of a diet.
Well, see, that's one of the things that people who advocate, like myself, high-carbohydrate diets say also is you can eat as much as you want, and we use the fact that there are a billion Chinese and they're all thin.
Yeah, I know, but if your diet, I can't tell you how many people I've had who've been doing that.
Yes.
And they're metabolically resistant to losing that way, and they lose the metabolic advantage of being on a low carbohydrate diet.